Hello and welcome to WorldCanvass from International Programs at the University of Iowa. I'm Joan Kerr and we're coming to you from Film Scene in downtown Iowa City and happy to have you with us this afternoon. We're going to have an interesting night tonight exploring the age of the Anthropocene through the lens of energy, investigating the global environmental transformation that has resulted from humans' astonishing technological achievements, whether inspired by the desire for greater creature comfort, more productive and predictable harvests, urban development, or any of 1,000 other things. Our insatiable desire to control our environment has led to almost unimaginable feats of scientific investigation and ingenuity, allowing millions to live in comfort and ease like never before. But the benefits that flow from harnessing the Earth's resources for power and energy are not shared equally by all, nor are they produced without significant and potentially catastrophic damage to the landscapes that fill our literature, inspire the world's artists, and will be the home for generations to come. I'd like to introduce my guest in this first segment of WorldCanvass. Just next to me is Bradley Cramer, assistant professor in the University of Iowa Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. Thank you for being here, Brad.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. And next to him is Tyler Proust. Hi, Ty. He's an associate professor in the University of Iowa Department of History. Thank you.
Great to be here.
Thank you. And Barbara Eckstein is at the far end. She's a professor in the University of Iowa Department of English. And these three people are responsible for organizing a symposium that is sponsored principally by the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies that we'll be talking about during this segment, and that many of you will have the chance to experience during the next few days. So I think our task as we begin this conversation will go first to you, Brad. I'd like you to define for us what the Anthropocene is.
Okie dokie. The Anthropocene as a term, it's very comical to begin this discussion by trying to define it because it is yet to be defined. And there is actually an organizational body of geologists who are responsible for doing things like naming official time periods. Okay, so very much the same way that Pluto is no longer a planet, right? That happened because a group of people who are responsible for such things got together and voted and decided it is no longer a planet. Same thing with the geosciences. There is a group of people who are responsible for making the decisions on what we call each individual period of time. Okay. Here in the last 15, 20, 25, 30, depends on how you want to define it, years, this concept that we are in a new interval of Earth history where humans are the dominant motive-changing force within the entire global environment has really begun to solidify around this idea that we needed a new term called Anthropocene. And it would be the Anthropocene age, most likely, that it would be introduced as, and that this is the new era or the new age in which we live. The debate that is going on within the geological community is we have some very difficult and sticky rules as to how one defines intervals of Earth history. And the primary holdup is that we define them based upon rocks. Well, if we're defining an interval that's only a couple of hundred years old, there are no rocks yet that are only a couple of hundred years old. So we're having this difficulty of, is it a cultural concept and a sort of construct within how we think about our role on the planet in search of a geological definition, or is it a geological thing in search of a broader cultural context? And so there is a very large public scientist debate going on this summer over in Austria that's going to hopefully begin to come to some conclusions about this topic. But in general, this is the concept of the Anthropocene as it is yet to be murkily defined, right. I think would be the way to say it.
But if we were to think about what's changed in the last 1,000, 2,000, or 20 years, or 50 years, what is it that has so significantly changed in the way humans interact with the environment that now people may be thinking we're in a new age or new era?
Okay, so all of the components of the Earth system feed back on one another. So every plant, every animal, every organism who does currently or has ever existed plays some role in what we now call the Earth system. So this is another 30, 40-year-old sort of concept where instead of thinking about just the plants or just the animals or just the ocean, we now approach it as a totality of the Earth system. In terms of what humans' impact are on that, the most obvious places to find that are things like CO2 levels in the atmosphere, things like what's happening to global temperature, what is happening to different elements that you're finding in the ocean. There is, of course, natural variability within the Earth system. That's not the issue. The issue is there is now becoming an imprint that is clearly the result of processes that humans are responsible for. And those are the items that we're trying to begin to define. I mean, Ty will talk about some of this stuff, hopefully in just a second, but the consensus is starting to form around wanting to put the onset of the Anthropocene essentially at the onset of the Industrial Revolution, simply because that's the easiest place to identify changes in CO2 that are undoubtedly man-made.
Right. Well, that does lead us directly into you, Ty, and the question of what energy has to do with the Anthropocene.
Well, the Anthropocene, the metaphor of the Anthropocene can mean a lot of different things. And I like to think of the geological metaphor of the Anthropocene inviting us to reconsider our relationship to the resources of deep geological time, primarily coal and oil and gas, which power our society. We can think about what is energy. You know, there are different ways to define energy, just like there are different ways to define Anthropocene. You know, for physicists, it's the physical properties of matter that enable the ability to do work, or we more conventionally think of energy as the physical and chemical resources that power our society. But I also like to think of energy in human terms. Energy as a social relation. We also use the term energy to refer to human strength and vitality. And so I am interested in investigating energy not as, you know, BTUs or kilowatts or barrels of oil or, you know, cubic meters of natural gas, but how do we use it? How do we think about it? How do our beliefs about energy shape the way we use it, and vice versa? Humans are a very adaptable species. The thing about the Anthropocene is we're making these large-scale impacts on the environment, but we are a species that is able to recognize it. Someone has said that the Anthropocene is a process that reflects upon itself. And energy implies that humans have the ingenuity, the vitality, the innovation to do something about the environmental problems we face. In the Anthropocene, it generally is seen as something very negative or apocalyptic. Elizabeth Colbert, who's a journalist, has said that the words Anthropocene and good should never be used in the same sentence. And responding to Andrew Revkin, who is saying who holds out much more optimism and hope about our ability to adapt to the circumstances of our own making. And so energy, yes, in the resources that we use, and the lights in the room, and the transportation fuels that allow us to move around in unprecedented ways are one way of looking at it, but there's a whole range of ways that we can think about energy.
Yeah. Human activity, going way, way, way back, has always altered the Earth in some way, right? In large ways, small ways, perhaps. Whatever else is happening in terms of, weather and, other environmental things that are happening outside of human control. We have always, whether by, starting fires someplace, burning down a forest, or, whatever, going way back, we've always had an influence on our environment in some way. The difference with the Anthropocene is just the massive nature of the impact?
Oh, I would say so. There is debate about when the Anthropocene began, even among non-geologists. Do we date it to 8,000 years ago when humans began to domesticate animals and agriculture, or 5,000 years ago when you started to see signals of methane in the atmosphere? But Paul Crutzen, the Nobel laureate chemist who sort of popularized this term, dates it to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, around 1800. Mainly because that's the beginning of, that is the moment when something dramatic changed in our mode of life, civilization, and relationship to the environment, and it has primarily, the primary reason is the adoption of concentrated forms of energy, first with coal, then with oil and gas, which is, has enabled our species to grow from 1 billion people in 1800 to 7 billion people today. Energy is what has made us a successful species, but it's also increasingly become a threat, and that is our dilemma. Charles Mann, and one of the underlying questions that really animates concern about this is, what kind of trade-off are we going to make between energy and climate change?
Mm-hmm.
Energy is what, intensive uses of energy is what explains our success. You can correlate intensive uses of energy with indicators of social well-being, across the board. And how are we going to deal with both the negative and positive aspects of this?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I know the symposium that's coming up, and also this program is using a term, energy cultures. What do we mean by energy cultures in the age of the Anthropocene?
We all see energy in different ways. We use energy in different ways. Our beliefs shape the way we use energy, and vice versa. And you look at how different cultures have embraced or use energy differently. There's a very interesting, there's a scholar coming from Norway who looks at the impact of electricity in rural Africa and Islamic culture. And I hope she's able to talk about how just illuminating a room changes the gender dynamics and social dynamics in that culture in ways that we just take for granted, because we expect the lights to always be on, and we don't really pay attention to where the electricity comes from except out of the wall, from the socket in the wall. We don't look behind that. I think we're coming to a point where we have to think beyond the wall, where it comes from, who it affects, who is disadvantaged by the way we use energy, who benefits, who's living in energy wealth and who's living in energy poverty. We need to, I think there's some consensus that we need to scale back our use of carbon-based fuels, fossil fuels. But you also have to remember that 1.3 billion people in the world don't have electricity. 18% of the population, 38%, or something like 2.6 billion, don't have access to clean cooking facilities. For those people, they need more energy. They need more cheap energy, and therein is the dilemma for the world as a whole.
Well, I love this phrase you used a minute ago, we need to think beyond the wall. That's, for me, a really sharp image. And Barbara, I'd like to turn to you. You're from the Department of English, and you're a scholar of literature and many things, but I know you've also been, for a long time, interested in kind of the way the environment and culture, the changes in natural landscapes affect people and the things we leave behind. What does something like the Anthropocene have to do with the humanities?
Well, I was thinking as Brad was defining it that there's a kind of central irony for the humanities in this term, Anthropocene, because it really, for humanists, decenters the human who's always been at the center of a humanistic study, rather than to suddenly bring the human to the center, in the sense that we study the products of civilizations and cultures over the lifetime of humanity, which compared to rocks is very short. And so when called upon to place our production in the kind of system that Brad is talking about, then we're no longer in the center. We're part of a mesh. And that really redefines everything we do from the beginning, which for me is one of the most exciting things about this conversation and all conversations like this. So it isn't just a question of what will cultural production be like going forward, but what does cultural production look like from the beginnings of human cultural production, if we imagine not humans at the center, but humans as part of an Earth system. So that's really the question that animates my work. And there's an image that really, or two actually, that solidified this Anthropocene idea in my mind. One had to do with a YouTube video that was put together by the very famous naturalist Attenborough, the British naturalist, and he's in Australia in a forest, and he's stalking in the way that he does a bird called a lyrebird, and this bird is just an extraordinary, some may know, an extraordinary imitator of other sounds, and mostly other birds. And so this bird has survived and thrived because of its ability to imitate others and therefore fool others. But what's so extraordinary in this video is that the bird not only imitates other bird sounds, but it imitates the shutter of a camera perfectly. So if you heard it apart from the bird, you would think it was the shutter of a camera. And so this immediately raises questions about the enmeshing of humans and these other species. But then Attenborough shows the bird imitating a chainsaw. And then we're in a whole other set of questions that are not just about our intrusion on its space as tourists, but our demands on its resources that it needs, and who will get the benefit of these resources. The other image that sticks in my mind is another use of chainsaws that I was introduced to that is a kind of activity of humans against humans that we're all too familiar with. And it's an image of Israeli soldiers with chainsaws cutting down very ancient olive trees on the property of Palestinian peoples, and the mayhem around this activity. And so if I put those two images together, then not only do we have this enmeshing, but we continue to have in an intensified way questions of human inequalities and human struggles over space and resources. So for a humanist, there's a tremendous amount of work to be done.
Wow. Well, while I have all three of you here, maybe I can ask you to tell us a little bit about some of the things questions you hope to answer, or at least have discussed at the upcoming symposium. What are the things that are primary in your mind that you hope these keynote speakers and others will be able to elucidate?
One of the things I would love to have a broader discussion on, and this came up in our seminar that we're running right now for graduate students here at the university, was the term Anthropocene is anthropocentric, which is an odd way to think about it, but it really is. There have been many species in Earth history that have actually had much larger impacts on the planet than humans have. So when Earth first was formed, there was no oxygen in our atmosphere. And so it was microbial life that turned us from a predominantly sulfidic and CO2 atmosphere into having oxygen in it. And this was wonderful. When plants invaded the land, that completely altered the planet once again. So we're not the first to ever have, entirely earth-shattering, to use that phrase, sort of impacts on the planet. The fundamental difference is that we're the first sentient, self-aware species to have that impact on the planet and be aware of what we're doing. To me, this is the natural bridge between the scientific component about the nuts and bolts of the chemistry and physics of the climate with the humanist component of the humanities overall, in where does that now take us, bridging that gap between those two entities.
So I'll ask you, Ty, what are you most interested in?
Well, I'm a historian, so I like to think in terms of time. And Barbara mentioned time and how the Anthropocene sort of disrupts our notions of time and our place in larger Earth history, right? The difficult thing about the Anthropocene for me as a historian is I like to look backwards, but it forces us to think about the future and how time is going to, evolve or how time is going to progress. There are different kinds of time. There's geological time, there's political time, and we know in this country that political time moves very slowly now, and it's moving too slowly for people who feel that we're in a crisis. And then as a, in a more academic sense, how might this make us reperiodize our understanding of human history? If we think of the the Industrial Revolution as more of an energy revolution than a revolution in property rights or, mechanical innovation, there's a lot of really interesting questions, I think, that if we start thinking about time and decentering ourselves from our understanding of time on Earth. Yeah.
And Barbara, what discussions do you hope to have over these next few days?
One that immediately comes to mind is maybe not so much directly within the humanities, but is underwrites the whole of what we do here, and it has to do with helping people understand what the words climate change mean. And that too has to do with time and our ability to conceive of time that's beyond human history in relation to human history, so that we understand how climate changes of the deep past have differed from this one. And I think it's a fundamental education that we all need. I feel as though I need to go to the Natural History Museum about once a month to remind myself 10,000 years back, 30,000 years back, to try and continue to remember the way in which deep time is different from human time. So that's certainly something that I hope people will gain from the experience.
Well, I think it's true that the issue of climate change as an international issue or discussion point has clearly, risen much, much higher over the last few years. And a lot of people I know consider this to be a very critical time right now. What we do now is going to have big impact 1 generation, 2 generations down the road. But what is your feeling? We're in an academic setting here. What is your feeling within the larger political climate? Clearly you think that we need to have more understanding. Do we have the tools to make the changes that we need to make it, at least at a preliminary level, to see ourselves progressing toward a better future in regard to climate change issues? I'll just ask anyone who wants to answer.
I mean, to get slightly philosophical about it for a moment, there was a really good quote by Carl Sagan, where he was asked, if you were able to run into an alien civilization, what was the first question you would ask? And his response was in response to actual nuclear weapons, not about climate change, but the same sort of concept applies here. And his question would have been, how did you survive your technological adolescence? That interval of time in which you had the capacity to seriously hinder your own ability to survive, but you had not yet developed the humanity, if you could apply that in this sentence, to get over those problems. And to me, that's kind of where we are with much of this question.
It's hard for me to speculate about the future. I resist doing that because I've studied too many speculations about the future that have been proven wrong. And that's what gives me hope, because there have been a lot of doomsday predictions in the last several hundred years. Almost every one of them has not been as dire as it turned out to be. And maybe I'm just being Pollyanna about it. But I really think there are some easy things we can do to reduce our energy consumption, to change it. That's the thing about humans, unlike every other species, is we are highly adaptable. For some reason, I'm becoming more of an optimist in my old age.
I think maybe we should leave it at that happy note then. That's great. That's great. So I want to say thank you very much to Barbara Eckstein, to Ty Priest, and to Brad Cramer for starting us off so well on this first of a three-part series, first segment on the Anthropocene and energy cultures. And thank you all for listening to this group of guests. Really very interesting and inspiring. And please stay with us for the second segment in this program, where we'll look at the environment as a right. As a reminder, you're invited to come to these live shows at Film Scene in Iowa City, or you can catch them later on UITV, YouTube, iTunes, and the International Programs website, which is international.uiowa.edu. You can learn more about Film Scene at icfilmscene.org. I'm Joan Kerr for International Programs here at the University of Iowa. Thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you next time. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.